Welcome to the Rise to Change podcast. I'm your host, Daniele Ascani.
And I'm your host, Marcela Torres-Noguera. We are mental health professionals with a private practice in New York City.
And guess what? We're not only partners in business, but also in life.
This podcast explores the everyday struggles of working professionals in New York City that we've seen throughout our combined 25 years of experience in the field and as well as in our personal lives.
Our motto is to normalize, not minimize.
On today's episode, we're going to talk about just who we are, how we got here, and the idea that we had to start this podcast to share just more resources about wellness, about just different options that we have as professionals in this city to feel more fulfilled and hopefully happier.
Awesome. Well, let's get to it. Well, before we start, let's hear about your wealth of experience and who are you? Tell us about you, Marcela.
Sure. So I basically moved to New York City when I was in my early 20s, and I moved here with basically my goal was to pursue my master's degree, and I did that, but my idea was to maybe go back to my country. I'm Colombian. I'm Colombian.
Whoa.
From South America,
okay.
And that's kind of like why I came. And I had some family in New York City, and then eventually things started happening. I got a job in my field while I was going to school, and then I just ended up kind of like extending my stay here, and then it's been almost 20 years.
When you say that then things started happening and everything, it wasn't always a smooth ride. I'm sure you ran into some obstacles there, and why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and which that's also the reason why we want to help people, right? The professionals.
Sure. So yes, definitely. I mean, just the experience of, coming to the U.S. and sort of like changing my life was a very big transition, to say the least. But also, I mean, just a little bit about, I guess, going back a little more, growing up, I did have in my family a few family members that struggled with mental illness and also physical illness. So, firsthand in my family, we did go through a lot of loss and grief just related to having those experiences in my own family. And I think that definitely was what inspired me to pursue a career in psychology. I did feel that if some of my family members, or if we as a family would have had more supports, that, the outcomes could have been better for a lot of my family members.
Sure. And you bring up a very good point, and I'm not sure that we can speak about Colombia as a whole, but I can tell you where I'm from. I grew up in Italy, looking for help, reaching out for help. It's something that is still very much, it was frowned upon when I was growing up and still frowned upon today. And what you're saying, it still happens to be true even for people who I see in the practice today, that it's hard to recognize that we need to reach for help. So yeah. I'm glad that that made you that's why we're doing this, right? To help people. And was there any defining moment you think that changed the direction of your life in that respect, or professional career in that respect? Was there anything that did it, like meeting someone or specific course that you took that hey, this is what I want to do?
Well, yes, but back in Colombia, I did take a couple of classes. I am very passionate about family therapy.
Okay.
And I took a couple of classes with a specific professor that she was, she's still somebody that I'm in contact with, and
Awesome.
She's like my mentor. And I just felt very passionate about the whole idea about working with families, and that started there. And then when I got here, I was able to go to the Ackerman Institute for the Family, and I studied there as well about family therapy. So I brought that with me. And I was also fortunate enough that my first job here was working with families in their in their settings, so going to their homes,
doing home visits. What is known in the field as home visits for all,
yes.
for all of you social workers out there, you know it.
Yes. So that was really, I mean, that experience was very, very powerful because I was able to actually, have that fortune almost, really, if I think about it now, to learn as I was kind of like learning the ropes of doing the work, but really trying to reach out families in their own environments, and having that ability to go into their homes was a very humbling experience.
And one of the things that I want to highlight here, knowing you, is the fact that you also kind of like went through a moment where your credentials coming from Colombia, you studied over there, right? You got a degree over there, but then you came here, you were going to pursue one type of degree, right? And then something changed. Why don't you tell us, why don't you describe what happened there?
So basically when I came to the States, my idea was to pursue a master's in psychology because my bachelor's was in psychology, and that was kind of like what I thought was the next step. But then when I got to the States, I did have to find more information, first of all, about what it meant to kind of like just have my degree sort of like accepted here, and how to do that, right? Which I guess it's, it's one thing that I do share with some of the clients that have been through these experiences, that it's kind of like, what do you do? Do
you have the right credentials?
Yes. Do I have the right credentials? Can I start working in my field?
Absolutely.
So that was definitely part of it. And then I also, I'm very grateful now that I look back. I did encounter a couple of people in my journey. One of them was a supervisor, and one of them was also a mentor that I had for many years. They basically explained to me that what I wanted to do, which was to eventually open my private practice, I just needed to getting a degree in social work was really clinical social work is really one way in which you can pursue that. And I had no idea in Colombia that's not how it is.
Well,
so
you
it's
thought
adapting.
that you were done with in a way, or at least that you got that out. And that's important because there's a lot of professionals out there who struggle with this, that they've been doing, they have been in the field for some time, and then they decide maybe to take it to the next level, or at least that's what they want to do. And they struggle with the fact, hey, kind of like, do I have the right credentials? And for kind of like that could be really kind of like a reason to lose motivation, because you may not have the financial resources, you may not have the time, right?
Yeah.
So kind of like, in a way, that's kind of like, I'm sure that must have been a factor kind of like for you. And that brings us to the fact that a lot of people here in the city, right? What I always say to kind of like everybody, it's like, everybody who moves to the city, they do that, generally speaking, for a couple of reasons. Either they are pursuing an education, or they're pursuing a career, or they're pursuing both, or they want to explore. But generally speaking, kind of like, I never hear anybody saying, I've moved here to meet the perfect person. There's always some type of like growth, whether it's professional or in terms of education, right? So, but with growth, there comes a lot of kind of like struggles and a lot of things that I think are unique to our city. Thank you. This is
why don't you share with us a little bit about your
it
experience?
was a smooth ride. It was well. So here's I moved to New York 25 years ago from Italy, and I began my I got my undergrad in psychology. My goal back then was to pursue a career in law enforcement, and then I got my master's. But I didn't want to sit idle, and I wanted to practice and hone my skills, my counseling skills, my interviewing skills. So I got a job out there in the heart of the South Bronx, and that was a life-changing moment for me because when I was going through that experience, it was the first time in my life that I struggled. I burned out. And we'll talk a little bit more about burnout because it applies not just to social work or counseling, but to a lot of other professions out there. And in burning out, I also found myself in a situation where I was confused. I'm like, maybe I've chosen the wrong career. Maybe kind of like my degree is not enough. Maybe I'm not good enough. I thought that I was good enough. So it kind of like I almost spiraled. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. I didn't spiral. I spiraled out of control. It affected my body physically. And finally, and I was able, someone suggested that I look for help. And in doing that, I reached out for a therapist, and I was able to do a little bit of work and realize that, in fact, kind of like I needed to slow down and reassess certain things, catch up with my sleep. And also we're going to talk about that, right? It wasn't necessarily that I chose the wrong career. It's just that I was also maybe working in a little bit of a toxic environment. And I also needed to maybe change and get a different type of credentials. Because back then, by the way, talking about life-defining moments, when I was working as a case planner, that's kind of like it's common if you're not familiar with social work, it's still true nowadays that you start in a position as a case planner or a case manager, and that's how I started. And I happened to do short-term assessment. I used to interview teenagers who had been through rough, difficult moments, difficult times, and one of those teenagers really kind of like changed my life because she confided in me. She kind of like described a situation where she was being abused. There was a lot of things going on, and I was like, wow, I remember taking for all of you Yankees fans. I was working by Yankee Stadium, and I remember after working that day, it was a summer day, taking the train back to the city, and I remember thinking, well, maybe I need to do this. Maybe I kind of like this is what I'm really good at, and that's kind of like that involved a lot of changing, credentials and thinking about things. So that's pretty much how it went.
But did that mean that so you had to go back to school?
Eventually, yes. I went back to school. And I pursued a degree that would allow me to have my private practice and have more flexibility in terms of career, which nowadays that's kind of like what I see a lot of people getting stuck. Well, maybe kind of like that. I think that's a perfect segue in talking a little bit about professionals in the city. What are they struggling with?
Yeah. So, I mean, in my experience, one thing that I'm seeing a lot more frequently lately is a lot of professionals struggling with social isolation, right? We have been, it's been 2 years where a lot of changes have happened. And a lot of people, were working from home, we are still working from home, but there was also kind of like this limitation to socialize in some way. And now people are trying to transition back to that. But a lot of professionals that I'm seeing, have felt pretty isolated for an extended period of time. And that affects, your mental health in different ways, right? I think, sometimes we don't realize how much maybe, like having that drink after work with our coworkers meant, right? Or means for our well-being and kind of like a sense of balance, or just grabbing dinner with a friend because you both kind of like around the same time and you can have a conversation and catch up, right?
I was going to say that now people grab a drink while they're working because you're not in an office, right?
Yes.
Which that's the other thing that we've seen an uptick and a dramatically increase in the use of kind of like alcohol and drug abuse. That's kind of like it's a big issue, kind of like that we're facing. But please continue.
Yeah. But so the social isolation definitely, and kind of like also that has created social anxiety going back to, or trying to go back to kind of like what our social life used to be like, or something similar to what it was, right? So just people that are starting to thinking about dating, but maybe not relying only on apps for dating,
Right.
right? So kind of like, where do I meet people, and that kind of thing,
Well,
which is
nowadays everything is done through an app, right? If you walk into a bar or somewhere, kind of like there's people that who probably kind of like organized and pre-planned, and they're there for a reason, unless they're tourists. But even kind of like you see a lot of people just relying on an app.
Yeah. Even for friendships, like I do have a few clients that are kind of like, I know that, I do need to make more, like I need to enrich my social life.
Network, yeah.
But, where do I meet friends? Especially, I guess, when you are kind of like, over 25, it starts getting kind of like more limited in a way, or at least that's how people feel, right? So that's a big one, I would say, the social isolation.
Is there kind of like I think you spoke some of the effects of isolation, but are there kind of like things that you see in terms of like the career, how that is affecting the person's perception of their career path? I also kind of like want to share a little bit about my experience.
Sure. I mean, I think that people have been working maybe longer hours, right? And for many people, home has become their office as well. So kind of like having those breaks, even if it's during a commute, that you kind of like have a break to read a book, or kind of like, I don't know, listen to your music or something like that. Like those things have really been limited for a lot of people, and they don't realize that that those breaks are not there anymore. So then, as you were saying, and I know you said you're going to say more about burnout, but definitely kind of like not realizing that in losing some of those possibilities, we kind of like start, I mean, our body reacts to it. So you see people that are having a lot of trouble sleeping at times, and just, we're not moving as much, right?
Exactly.
So it's kind of like, not only, I mean, some people are worried about like changes in their weight, but also, physically, like, we're not as active. And in New Yorkers, we're pretty active, right? Like we're used to walking around, and like, I mean,
I've had more than one of my clients telling me, "Hey, I don't feel I'm ready to go to the office because I've gained weight, and I don't have anything that fits." Right? So it's kind of like, I want to go maybe one day a week, or that's the other thing. It's kind of like, how do you make sense of that? One of the things that kind of like what I see a lot, and it has to do with what you mentioned, not moving enough, or kind of like working like remotely, is that the burnout goes like this. Lots of people go directly from, let's say they start working at a specific time, 8 a.m., and maybe they have a quick lunch, if that, because depending on the type of job that they do. And then automatically they get to 5 p.m. And guess what? The only thing separating them from kind of like the rest of the responsibilities is a door. And there used to be that commute that you spoke about, right? So kind of like automatically, I have a number of clients who tell me like, look, I self-care and I do this and I do that, but it doesn't work. And I'm like, well, and eventually you do a little bit of digging, you find out there's only a door separating that person from, let's say, the person may be a parent, or the person may have other responsibilities. And so that there's never a moment to kind of like, there's never a buffer. And what I like to work with clients on, that's the thing. First, acknowledge the fact that there's no buffer, but there used to be. Even though it was just a commute, even though it was like 10 minutes where you could maybe, listen to a podcast like this one, or kind of read a book, right? That's gone, right? And that's true for a lot of people. So that's one of the things that I see a lot. And in other words, it's the burnout, but it's burnout because boundaries, as we call in the field, have disappeared. There's no longer boundaries. Right? And that's the personal becomes your kind of like professional, and they're all blended together. And people are having a difficult time because then kind of like, again, the anxiety, the depression, the substance abuse, the isolation, the not having enough support. Are there other things that, for example, one of the things that I know you work with couples, and I think that I mean, I hate to bring the pandemic here, but the pandemic has caused a lot of changes, right?
Sure.
Not just to working remote, but do you see couples, for example, what have you seen, like in terms of like changes or in terms of like issues that people are struggling with, couples are struggling with?
Yeah. I mean, definitely, I think that, a lot of couples have had to, a lot of them have had to spend a lot of more time together,
right?
Right? And sometimes, that can create definitely some disagreements or frictions that, when you have, I mean, in couples having, your me time or your own space is healthy, right? We know that, but under certain circumstances and what has been happening throughout the pandemic is that, a lot of those spaces changed for couples as well, right? So that's one. So kind of like having to spend more time together and kind of like not knowing how to do that because we never before had to spend as much time with our partners than if we were confined or we were kind of like working all from home and at the same time, of course, we have couples that have kids already, so they're also parenting and kind of like facing some of the challenges of parenting together.
Right.
Maybe, when one of the partners was the one that maybe assumed that role in a more
assertive.
No, in a more clear way, and the other one was working all the time or something like that. So now it's like all of those changes are really having an impact on, but this is, now that you're here, you should help me with this. Or like, now that you're here, like maybe you can do laundry or like, but really a lot of communication problems, which is a pretty common reason for, couples reach out to us, and a lot of them say, we are finding that we have a really hard time talking to each other. Like it's, we get into silly disagreements and fights, and it feels like, I don't know, like almost like we can't find things we had in common, or like we almost wonder, how did we get here, right? Like what's going on? And
there's so much that you can do when you spend the past 2 years together, right? It's not that kind of like, even when you say kind of like you can go on a vacation, like with the same person? Like, are you serious? No, I want to go by myself. But it brings up that communication that you're talking about. I think it is essential because it has to do, it always has to do with those boundaries in a way that disappeared pretty much overnight or gradually, depending on the situation, where basically people, they had to, before the communication was one person or the couple would leave in the morning, right? They would go out, right? And home was really kind of like the central place, the place where you go back and you're even in Manhattan, the island within the island. Right. And now kind of like what you saw is that, well, that person is no longer leaving. Right. Like, tell me about your day. Well, you saw me kind of like, I went to the bathroom. I went to the kitchen. I picked up a package from Amazon. It's kind of like, what else do you say to each other? And I think it's difficult for people to get to understand that there has been a change, and it was a major change. We're not going to get into necessarily, like I said, into the whole thing caused by the pandemic, but a lot of things have, the society that we live in today is significantly, it's very different than what we knew back in 2020 in February, and then March, everything changed, right? And it's very frustrating for a lot of people. It's kind of like, it's really, from my point of view, it's also helping the couple, right? I'm not sure if you see the same thing. Helping the couple first realize that a change has occurred, and it's not necessarily kind of like on the couple. It's just that we as a society have changed.
Yeah, it's like these have been real circumstances that have affected all of us in some way, and of course our relationships too. I was just thinking, as you were talking about, also the other piece about social isolation is also, people that do not have family close by, right? So sort of like losing that ability. I mean, for some time, now things are changing, and thankfully, that's happening. But a lot of people also were away from their families or had like a lot more limitations to see their family. Like I personally, like I wasn't able to see my dad for like over 2 years.
Wow.
Throughout this period. So, those like having some losses, right? Very
Grief.
real losses and grief about, not being able to be around family. Definitely is something also that affects individuals, affects couples,
Right.
Because sometimes, family can be the source of support, right? Or kind of like that's how you take sometimes a little break because you can go on a date with your partner when, your mom maybe is watching your kid, or like people have lost that too.
And I think with that loss, there's also, people forget, I see that quite a lot, and I always have to break it down to the clients that I work with. They forgot that we're pretty much behind 2 years. So those 2 years that we've lost, and a lot of people feel that way, pretty much, maybe some people had plans to kind of like, some people got promoted even before the pandemic, right? Or some people were going to accept a job, or, they were going to go to college somewhere. I have a lot of younger clients who had certain plans. And then all of a sudden that changed. So overall, I see a lot of professionals really feeling I'm behind. I feel that I have to play catch up. Like I'm always catching up. I don't feel that I have the right credentials, or I don't feel that I feel that already old, kind of like to do certain things. Think about, for example, kind of like, in certain professions, there's a certain kind of like sometimes you're limited in terms of what you can do, your career, right? So it's kind of like, I think that's important to always acknowledge and clarify again. Normalize it, but not minimize it. If you feel that way, if you feel behind, if you feel that you're playing catch up, kind of like, we also have to acknowledge that that's there, first of all, but that's not necessarily due to the fact that you just didn't want to do anything. I know some people kind of like have also feel, you can self-blame. I'm pretty sure you see that quite a lot, people self-blaming, or people kind of like feeling that they should have done more and everything. But first, I think it's important to acknowledge that lots of changes nowadays are caused by just kind of like the past 3 years.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And, it's as you're saying this, I was thinking, of course, we have been through a lot of loss, right? And a lot of the clients that we have seen have experienced these losses. But also, there's the other side of the coin, right? It's kind of like there also has been a gain in the sense that being under these very unique circumstances has made, has kind of like made people face different situations. Like, I'm thinking that, some people have realized that maybe, they were really unfulfilled in their career, and that maybe, thinking about everything that has happened, like they have been able to, let's say, enroll in a online class about something that they were very curious about, but because of time, like maybe before they never really allowed themselves to explore that. And it's like, so it's also, it's kind of like the losses and some gains, like, that people can kind of like, maybe they had the opportunity in a way also to reevaluate and kind of like reassess a lot of what was already kind of like a given, right?
Absolutely. Like, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one of the things that in our field, they're called reframes, kind of like, but a lot of times I see a lot of clients kind of like really not giving themselves credit for a lot of the things that have been through.
Yeah.
And I think, we come up with reframes, which is pretty much it's short for another way to look. You want to go from a negative to an kind of like a neutral and a positive, right? But I have a number of clients who kind of like, the work that we do is first to acknowledge that, hey, tell me a little bit about that. Kind of like, because I don't know, not a lot of people can pull that off. And kind of like that helps the person and the professional, because a lot of people feel like, well, I'm not good enough, which kind of like, I want to be respectful of the time here. But one of the things that I want to remind kind of like our audience, the fact that you are in the most competitive city in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Everywhere you go, every kind of like, I always like to break it down. Like you're pretty much surrounded by lots of people who come here to be great. And it can be stressful, even if you already have kind of like, let's say, a good education, or you feel that you have good, a great work experience, right? So a lot of time people feel like, well, but I got to do more. I'm okay with doing more. But in doing more, it's also being aware of your mental health.
Yeah.
And how much the city itself can also stress you out. And, there's a combination of things, boundaries and things that we all have to communication, right? But the reminder here is kind of like, it's like you are where everybody comes to play.
Yeah.
Right? And talking about your experience as an immigrant, right? By the way, whether you're an immigrant or from out of state or even from a different borough, you could be moving from Long Island to the city.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, I think it puts us on the same level. You want to you want to do something. You want to be better than when you came in.
Yeah.
Right? And we want to help you with that, right? We want to help people that, kind of like with all those things. And we're going to have, I think, we have a few guests line up in future podcast episode. But one of the things is help the professionals that are struggling with certain things. And we're going to highlight what those things are and invite guests over to speak about it and provide with kind of like a list or maybe alternatives or kind of like resources, like you call them, that can really make a difference and, can help you maybe think outside the box.
Yeah.
I think we're right at the kind of like the top of the clock here. And thank you. We're going to do this again.
Yes. Well, thank you all for listening.
What's our motto?
To normalize, not minimize.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.